So welcome everybody to the penultimate visual politics seminar of the seminar series here at UQ. This evening we're discussing the topic of settler military aesthetics with Dr. Federica Caso, who I'll introduce in a second. In the last seminar, which is Wednesday, 4th of December, we'll talk about art and migration with Dr. Kaya Barry, and the series will resume next year in March. Sadly, Professor Roland Bleicher, who's sort of a fixture of the series, couldn't be with us tonight. He sends on his apologies. And if there's any technical issues, surprisingly enough, he's the one who sort of runs that. So sorry about that. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather tonight, the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I extend this respect to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or First Nations guests with us tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions the First Nations people have made to global society and Australian society. And, within the context of the discussion we're having tonight, the contributions that Dr. Caso has drawn on extensively as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Federica Caso, who I know personally. She's a lecturer in international relations at Trobe University, where she's won this year the Research Excellence Award for early career researchers in the humanities and social science. She's published in International Political Sociology, Security Dialogue, and the Australian Journal of Political Science, among other places. I had the pleasure to work with Federica here at UQ while she was completing her Ph.D. here, entitled Liberal Militarisation, Visualizing the Military Body as a Form of Governance. And we both shared Roland as a supervisor. So we'll be sharing stories about that afterwards, I'm sure. Her thesis was awarded the prize for the best PhD in gender and politics in 2020 by APSA. It's a pleasure to have her back here, obviously in person as well. So she flew here to be with us. So that's something that doesn't usually happen in this series. And we're here tonight to discuss her new book, Settler Military Politics, Militarisation and the Aesthetics of War Commemoration, published by Edinburgh University Press, as well as some of her latest work published in the journal Security Dialogue. So thanks again for being here. The format of the seminar, before we kick it off, so there'll be 30 minutes of interview of back and forth between me and Federica, and then we'll have a 30-minute Q&A, so questions from the room and questions from online. And then for those of us in the room, we will go to St. Lucy's afterwards, if you're available and so inclined, to share a meal and some drinks. So let's kick it off. It's, I think, not lost on me that it's two white settlers here for the first half hour talking about settler military politics. And you address this in your book, obviously, in the introduction. But I wanted to start by asking you, sort of for the audience, what motivated you to write the book, how you went about writing this book as a settler yourself, and what kind of audience you had in mind for the book.
Awesome. First of all, I want to say that it's a pleasure to be back at UQ and to be part of this visual politics seminar series, which I've been following for years now. And yeah, so I'm really pleased that everybody's here in the room, and thank you all for joining online. And before I address the question, I also want to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of Mianjin, and also the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, Melbourne, where I work and live these days. And perhaps this is a good place to start talking about how I got to this book. So when I came to Australia in 2015, I knew pretty much nothing about Indigenous politics, settler politics, Indigenous peoples, but I did have a strong interest in difference, diversity, and society. And I think that interest comes from the fact that growing up in Sardinia in Italy, I wasn't really exposed to diversity. So when 9/11 happened, I think that there was a moment when, I think we were all confronted with diversity, and I saw that there was a growing, the people around me were hating people that they didn't even know. They were just like, yeah, there was like this sense of Islamophobia and fear of diversity. And so I think at that point, you know, I was kind of like encountering diversity for the first time. And so I think I had two choices, right? So I could have just joined the flow and, you know, just joined the flow of hatred, or I could have tried to understand how society deals with diversity. And I ended up taking the second path. I moved to London, which is, you know, such a multicultural place. And that was perhaps like the ideal place to study diversity and difference in society, especially as a student of international relations at that time. And so that's how I developed the interest in diversity. But then when I came to Australia, difference and diversity looked quite different compared to the UK. It was more about, you know, I started learning about First Nations peoples and how they got dispossessed from their land and they became a minority in their own country. And so it became evident that that was, you know, like the core of the issue of diversity in society here. And so when, you know, like I started becoming interested and curious in Indigenous resistance, and you know, I'm still an activist. I was an activist. I was interested in trying to understand, you know, Indigenous movements of resistance, and yeah, that's how I basically understood that colonization is well and alive in this country, and that I was part of the problem as a settler. So I think I needed to come to terms with my new identity as a settler in Australia. And I think for me, it was like an understanding that I needed to, at least like at the very bare minimum, understand the history of this place. I could have not lived here and be ignorant of Indigenous politics, Indigenous struggles, the politics of colonization. Like, why are the people, why are the Indigenous peoples in this country, you know, raising their voice? I think it was my responsibility to understand that. And so that's how I became acquainted to Indigenous politics when I was living in Brisbane. And in terms of what motivated me to write the book, so when I started my PhD here at UQ in 2015, I was not working on the topic that ended up being the book. I was working on visual politics of war, militarized nationalism in liberal societies, Australia included. And so I went to Canberra to do fieldwork research at the Australian War Memorial. And that's where things happened. There was a special exhibition on Indigenous military service, which I just could not, like, it just left me puzzled. So I went back to Brisbane and I asked Roland to change my topic because that was what I wanted to work on. Of course, Roland put sense in my mind and he was like, no, you should pursue your topic. Otherwise, you're going to get lost. And which I did. I ended up writing my PhD thesis on the topic that was originally proposed. But as soon as I finished the PhD, the first thing that I did was to go back to the exhibition and write my first article, post-PhD on that. So there was the article that came out in the Australian Journal of Political Studies, Political Science. And I was very happy with the article, but I felt like I only scratched the surface. And so basically I ended up writing a book on that topic. Like I just kept digging into it, and then the book came out, like sparked by the exhibition that to me just didn't make sense. And what didn't make sense was the fact that, you know, while in Brisbane, I became acquainted with the Indigenous resistance against colonization. This was an exhibition that was celebrating Indigenous service. And for me, like there was the disconnect, the cognitive disconnect of like, one, why did Indigenous people want to serve in a country that, I mean, technically until at least like the end of World War I was still waging the so-called frontier wars against, or the frontier wars of colonizations. So what was going on there? You know, like what animated the Australian War Memorial to all of a sudden include Indigenous peoples in that particular way? So a special exhibition is only a temporary exhibition at the Australian War Memorial, so it wasn't integrated in the rest of the memorial. So there were like those questions that I just, you know, kept going back to, and that was the exhibition that basically sparked the whole book.
So my next question was going to be about turning the PhD into a book, but it sounds like your case was probably a bit fraught because you wanted to start writing a book before you'd finished your PhD. But presumably you drew on a lot of your PhD work in this book. So I was wondering what sort of, and then we'll get to the meat of the subject, but just a practical question, if you have any advice for, ECRs or PhD students, people like me who are, thinking about turning the thesis into a book. How'd you go about it? What are the key sort of pieces of advice you have?
Persistence, perseverance. So writing the book was hard. Like, there's just no question about it. It was hard. It took me longer than I expected. But it was also joy. And I've always wanted to write a book. And so for me, it was, once I had the book in my hands, I was like, yes, I did it. I've published a book. It was just, I don't know, like I remember being a child and pretending to play at being a writer. So nerd. But this book was challenging because the data that I ended up using was put in a different framework. So as I said, the data that formed the book was collected for a different project. And then as I moved more and more towards the framework of settler colonialism, I had to revisit, sometimes even integrate new data to make this book. And there are some significant limitations, right, of using data that is collected for a different project. And like the clear limitation for me was that, the data was not designed for the project. And I think that if I could have done the project differently, I would have probably used a different set of data. But, I guess that we all have to come to terms with the fact that there are limitations that are, circumstantial. There are limitations that are like, we can't always produce the best work, right? So we're always only just adding a piece of knowledge and information to a larger, mosaic of information. And sometimes what we put in the word is not what, like we might revisit what we put in the word and think that, we could have done it differently, or we could have done it better. And we are our worst critics. So I think that if we can kind of like overcome that voice that is in our mind that tells us, you're not good enough, or you can't do this, then you're half the way there. And so it's about, persistence. It's about overcoming feelings of inadequacy. I think the one thing that Roland taught me during the PhD was consistency, write every day or as often as you can, so that you're not just living, like you're not coming back to it once in a blue moon, right? So I think the consistency was quite important for me, which wasn't always, possible. There was a pandemic while I was writing the book. There was unemployment, underemployment, pressures, so from various different fronts. So various different challenges. But yeah, I think persistence and perseverance are two key things for people that want to turn a thesis into a book.
Well, thankfully, with Roland as a supervisor, I've also got the consistency one down, I think. To jump into the meat of the topic of your book, I think it's probably good to start with a definition, right? And so you note that militarization is quite an intuitive concept. Most people sort of have an idea about, what it might be, which is why it's rarely defined. And so you define it as, quote, a governing rationality predicated on the valorization of Western-centric armed forces and war. But you go on to claim that, quote, the ultimate purpose of militarization is not war. Rather, it's a means to consolidate the settler state and legitimize settler authority. So obviously, for those of us who don't study militarization, this definition that you provide is actually rather counterintuitive, because it's probably not how most people would think about militarization. So can you explain a bit how that operates within the Australian context?
Yeah, so for my PhD thesis, so the main topic of the PhD thesis revolved around these two concepts, militarism and militarization. And I think I felt some sense of frustration because I was reading a lot of literature on these terms, but the definitions were either completely absent or sometimes even contradictory. And so I just wasn't satisfied. So I ended up, so I did like all the work of categorizing literature, like rereading it, and honestly, like the chapter on concept ended up being rewritten so many times. And sometimes I'm still trying to make sense of these two terms and the literature. The literature was quite vast on these topics in the first half of the 20th century. And then somehow, like with the end of the Cold War, disappeared until then 9/11 happened, and then there was a kind of like a rediscovery of these concepts. And I think that in these waves of like in the waxing and waning of militarism, militarization, the concept has changed. So I ended up drawing primarily from the feminist literature in international relations and also military sociology, which I think are two key literatures that take these concepts seriously and they bother with definitions. Whereas in international relations, I think that there is these, as I say in the book, there is almost like an assumption that everybody knows what militarization is when basically states arm up and then they go to war, which I find it to be quite a limiting definition. So, so as I was working through this literature, this feminist literature and military sociology literature, it became evident to me that there was a point in common between, like they were somehow talking about different things, but there was a commonality between them, which was that they were talking about how military preparation, or let's say, the preparation for war that occurs through, preparing, the military, is not simply to wage war, but it's something that has significantly shaped societies. And I think that for me, the hook was into kind of like the thing that made me understand this was the feminist literature on militarized masculinity, which basically was claiming that that the military experienced, especially through conscription in Europe, significantly affected the development of masculinity as, like throughout the 20th century and even today. So you can't really understand masculinity today until you trace the history of it, especially in conscription. Then I'm a Foucauldian. I'm always doing genealogy. I like to look at the past to understand the present. That's what I do. And so in that context, it became evident to me that conscription wasn't just about cultivating certain types of masculinity, but it was also about creating gendered and racialized political subjectivities that are attached to the nation. And so basically, like especially by looking at conscription in the context of Europe, I was trying to understand how the militarization of men and of course, attendant militarization of women, even when they were not going, even though they were not conscripted, was basically like creating societies as we know them today, right? So in the military or in conscription, in the barracks of conscription, men were learning the common language of the nation. They were learning, kind of like solidarity between nationals. They were learning like the history of their nation, like these, and these are, we think of these concepts as quite timeless, but actually they're fairly recent and they're also quite iterative. So they come from processes. And I think that a process that is quite crucial for that is the militarization of men primarily, but also how the militarization of men affected women as well. And so in that kind of context, by militarizing men, and if it's true that men and women are somehow like somehow like complementary, then they were shaping society, right? So they were creating society as a nation, as we know it today. I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
in your book, so your book is about war commemoration, essentially, and the role that that plays in militarizing society. And so one key device you talk about, or dynamic through which this occurs, is militarized atmospheres, right? And so you develop this in your latest article published in Security Dialogue. And this is a concept that comes from geography. Could you tell us, in international relations and politics, how this functions and what it does?
Yeah, so the article took me 4 years to get published.
That's reassuring.
I mean, perseverance is just like the book, right? So if you keep trying, but it went through significant changes as it was rejected and resubmitted. The process helped. That's what I mean. That's what I want to say. So what I wanted to do with that concept. So the reason why I ended up drawing that concept from the literature in human geography is because I wanted to understand the experience of war commemoration. Basically, how does war commemoration, how does militarization as a rationality of governance operate in contexts such as war commemoration? And I thought that the literature on visual politics wasn't giving me enough because war commemoration is experiential, right? So you're not just saying something, you're literally putting your body in an experience. And so the concept of atmosphere allowed me to basically look at how we immerse ourselves with our bodies and how we create knowledge and experiences that stick onto the body that they create basically that end up becoming what can we say, a kind of a background canvas that through which we make sense of the world. So what I kind of so when I was so basically atmosphere is a concept that describes the quality of an event as it is basically constituted in the interaction between the space design, which is quite important in a commemorative setting, and the way that people interact with it. And so, you might have a great space design, but if people don't interact with it, then you might have a different kind of atmosphere, right? But the space design is quite important to enable people to interact in a certain way. So what I found in the article, or when I was developing the article, was that Australia's war commemoration works through basically a religious aesthetic. And so I looked at, for example, the positioning of what I call the soldier martyr projected onto the walls of the memorial, and the use of black and white as colors that basically evoke nostalgia, but also, all the participants look at these massive images looking up, so they become kind of almost apparitions and there's something almost angelic in these figures, right? So there's the sense of reverence. And so I look at these basically use of religious aesthetics to commemorate Australian soldiers at the dawn service. And I think that what I found in the article by looking at these what I call militarized atmosphere is that there are two effects of these of war commemoration. So basically, it puts the body of the participant into these again embodied narrative that World War I was the foundation of the nation, and that these soldiers that we are looking at were projected into the walls of the memorial are the fathers of the nation. And I think that those are not conscious, we don't arrive at these conclusions in a conscious way, but rather it is through the militarized atmosphere, right? So it is by embedding ourselves in that kind of context that we gain that knowledge and understanding of the foundations of the nation and the founding figures of the nation.
So obviously, when you're writing about this kind of stuff, you're writing about your own experience attending ceremonies or joining protests and so on. And so in the introduction of your book, you have field notes. You have 3 vignettes from your field notes. And I thought they worked as a great device for conveying these atmospheres, as you call them. And they're written in a way that is, I was going to say non-academic. That's not what I mean, but it's very relaxed and evocative and very visual as well. And I thought that was a great device for sort of introducing this concept. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us about maybe the role of writing and conveying sort of aesthetic experiences and so on, or visual experiences.
Yeah, I wrote the introduction of the book a million times, and most of them were without the 3 vignettes. And every time that I was going back to it to read it or edit, and I just found it boring. Like, how can I hook a reader into my story? How can I explain my story or the story of this book? So that was the question that I had. So I ended up drawing from my fieldwork notes. So the vignettes are basically like my experience as I recorded it in the fieldwork notes. And that was basically like my way to get the reader into how I got to the topic. And I think, most of my work draws from feminist international relations scholars who are trailblazers in this kind of writing. So they have been writing in first person, in ways that highlights the experience and the experiential learning. So like I wasn't really, breaking paths, but I was drawing from them, right? So it is because of them that I can do stuff like this. And I think it's very effective in the ways in which he allows to share. Like, I don't think that we can talk about aesthetics or even visual politics if we're not talking about how we encounter the visual politics. How do we encounter? There was no way that I could have talked about militarized atmospheres if I hadn't talked about my experience as a person who also participated in those atmospheres, right? So in the article and also in the book, I use my body as an instrument of research. Of course, thinking about all the caveats of I was trying to take notes, to take pictures, reread my experience, right? So I wasn't just using, like, I wasn't making my subjectivity the main subject of the article. So I was just trying to, again, like, use my body as an instrument of research, which I think we all do in a way or another, but there are people that are a bit more open and honest about how we do it. And some people that are just a bit, they probably hide behind the mask of objectivity.
Great. And then maybe just a last question before we move to the Q&A. It's a big one. You've spent years now looking at the links between militarization and aesthetics, the unique role of visuality, but aesthetics, more in general, like you just talked about, senses, emotion, atmospheres, and so on. What do you think that aesthetics in particular can tell us about the political role of militarization that other forms of inquiry can?
Yeah, so for me, as I said before, militarization is a governing practice, right? And I think that aesthetics can illuminate basically like the canvas through which we know the military. So I think that, yeah, like I was thinking about a couple of examples, right? So if someone only encounters military aesthetics that include only men in uniform, right? So the first time that they see a woman in uniform, they're like, what is that, right? It makes no sense. And so there is like a form of like embodied knowledge that perhaps like this person might have never even thought about, the fact that other genders also might have a military experience. So as soon as they, like, if they've only encountered, aesthetics of military, of men in uniform, when they see something that is different from that, it doesn't make sense, right? And similarly, if a person only has experienced, white people in military uniforms, as soon as they see a non-white person in uniform, that might, I think, they might be confused, or they might be, or even, like, surprised or perhaps even angry, like, what is this person doing with the uniform of my country, right? So, and I think that those are the emotions that are elicited by what I'm calling military aesthetics. They're not just visuals or images, but, you know, like military or experiences where people encounter the military. So those are like, those emotions are where basically like the real governing power of militarization, or the aesthetics of militarization, happen, because they can normalize, or they can, you know, they can normalize certain experiences, or and vice versa, they can punish when those experiences are, let's say, not within the canon. And a case that I talk about in the book is, for example, the feminist anti-war protest in Australia in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where basically a bunch of Australian feminists wanted to raise awareness of the case of women raped in war. And they decided to use Anzac Day commemoration as a platform to do that. And it was quite interesting because they ended up using a rhetoric which framed basically all male soldiers as potential rapists. Like, so they weren't saying that they're all rapists, but, you know, they can all, they're potentially all rapists. And that was really challenging the idea of the Anzac soldier as the founding father of the nation, as this figure that we need to look up to. And this was also a time when women weren't really going too much in to war commemoration. So I think that their presence, like the presence of the female body in a commemorative setting, and especially the female body in a commemorative setting as protesters, was really challenging the military aesthetics that Australians were used to. And like the consequences of those protests were quite significant, not just because several women ended up in prison, but also because there were public ordinances that were issued to avoid protesters from protesting on Anzac Day ever again, right? So I think that the impact of that is quite significant, and that was ensued by basically like the surprise, the shock, the anger that these women caused. In the book, I talk about so there is I found this story of a soldier that was reacting, a veteran that was reacting to these women protesting, and he had a prosthetic leg, and he took his prosthetic leg and he was shaking it in the air, basically calling their names and saying that these, in a very non-polite way, like these bitches hold their freedom to men like him, while he was shaking the prosthetic leg in the air, right? So, and I think that like there's a lot of visual happening there that it's quite interesting to unpack. But yeah, so basically, like you can see that these female demonstrators really activated the anger of some people. And I think that the other example is the recent inclusion of Indigenous people in war commemoration, which, you know, in a way, you know, it's an aesthetics that normalizes the service of Indigenous people. So, you know, like on the one hand, it's like that's great, right? But I think that this is also happening at a time when there is a selective process of Indigenous subjectivities that can be included in the nation and others that can't. And in the work that I'm doing on war and the military, in the context of Australia, it's evident that while the Indigenous soldier can be included in war commemoration, the frontier wars, or the warrior against the Europeans who fought the wars against colonization, still cannot be included in that kind of war commemoration. So there is a process of selection that is happening, and yeah, so I think that there is like in the book, I talk about the militarization of Indigenous peoples as they get included in these war narrative, especially in the context in which there is a selective, like a process of selection where colonial warfare still remains excluded.
So that selection process is run by the state for its own benefit.
Mm.
Yeah.